Welcome to another episode of the Mystery Bible on podcast. We are on episode 18, where we will be discussing some current events and also discussing the next section coming up in our Birthright series. Tonight, you have myself and you have our good friend and co-host Dan Rundio. We don't have Brian tonight. He is under the weather. You can say a prayer for his health. His energy was flagging, and we said, look, sit this one out, come back stronger for the next one. I'm sure that the Lord will provide for him. So you've got Joel and Dan, kind of like the good old days. And we are going to discuss some current events, as I mentioned, specifically some of the recent UFO whistleblower conversation that you've probably seen in the news a lot. If not, then you're going to be familiar with it now. And also we will discuss the next part of the Atlantis chapter in Birthright. So that's what we have for you. As always, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. We're so humbled by what the Lord's been doing with this podcast. We're so excited to have as many people as our faithful listeners. We appreciate the feedback we've been getting, the encouragement we've been getting on these episodes. This is a service to you, and it's our joy to serve you in this way and bringing whatever we can and whatever we have for any given recording. So don't forget to share. Don't forget to join the discussion thread. Some of you, if you're on the Apple iTunes, by the way, which is something I'm not as familiar with, I don't know if you can see the same show notes everybody else can see. So if you cannot, and you keep hearing us talk about these show notes and the links and all this stuff, go to mysterybibleon.com. And you should be able to send us a message from there. I think, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's info@mysterybibleon.com is another way you could reach us through email and just say, hey, I want to join the Telegram thread and I don't have the show notes and so I don't have a link, and we will happily send it to you. So we don't want anybody to be left out of there and left out of those conversations. If it's something you want to participate in, of course. We're not exactly hawking social media. I spend very little time on social media myself, but we do like to provide a place for people to interact with us and each other and ask questions and talk about what they're learning about or thinking about from the episodes. We think that's a positive thing. So all that being said, let's get into the conversation. I want to pass the mic to Dan just to give his thoughts just on some of the current events. Dan, I know you've been seeing, because we've been sending some messages and including Brian on our own personal thread on some of the stuff that's been going on in the news. What's going on out there? Why is everybody suddenly talking about UFOs again, maybe more than ever? Why is this such an interesting time to be having this conversation?
Yeah, the whistleblower stuff that's coming out, right? So there was a guy who came out who was saying that the parts of the government have retrieved crashed non-human origin ships, basically, that the government is working on reverse engineering and that's being hidden from Congress. So he came out under this whistleblower protections that are fairly new and sharing his story. And that's been interesting. I've read a lot of different reactions to that particular whistleblower, and everything from people talking about how credible he is and how much what he's saying is spot on and we need to listen to him, to people tearing him apart and saying it's completely ridiculous and everything he's saying is made up, to people saying, something in between, like he's not really a whistleblower. He's actually just still working in intelligence and, giving the information that he's being told to give to throw people off the scent. So whatever you make of it, I don't know. I never met the guy or talked to him. I did see today that there's apparently been a string of other whistleblowers that are not public yet, that are, as Senator Marco Rubio was talking about, there's quite a few of them that have been fearful for their professional lives, certainly, if they were to come forward publicly. So, it's interesting stuff. There's obviously more and more sightings. It's becoming more and more of a mainstream topic. I even saw another article where there was somebody talking about the idea that spaceships flying around are really just demons, which is another topic that we've addressed earlier in the podcast. So that's my 2 cents. What are you thinking, Joel?
Yeah, that's a great summary. I'll add a little color commentary just so that people have the spectrum, because sometimes we hear names and headlines and stuff, and I want to try to tie together just a little bit of kind of end to end what happened, why is this in the news, why is everybody talking about it. So there's a news outlet called News Nation, which is presumably a legitimate outlet. It's not, Fox or MSNBC or CNN, but it's cannibalized some pretty big names from some of those big outlets, and it holds itself out to be, the less manipulated, less controlled, less party line towing, from whatever side of the spectrum. They're supposed to be more of a third party, just another news outlet. And one of the investigative journalists there is Ross Coulthart. He is, I believe, an Australian journalist, and he's done a lot of interviews and documentaries in the UFO space as from that Australian perspective. He released an interview, or he did an interview that was released by News Nation in June, so earlier this month, with a gentleman named David Grusch. David Grusch, if you look at his background on Wikipedia, it's going to say he's a decorated combat officer with the USAF, or United States Air Force. He's a veteran of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office. And this is recent, from 2019 to 2021, et cetera. He was the representative of the NRO to the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force. He was the co-lead UAP for analysis at the NGA and its representative of the task force. So he's neck deep in this stuff professionally. That's his career. His career has been very involved with UAPs, special Air Force projects. He's been reporting to or supporting other UAP task forces, and he has a pretty good track record and background. He's not some kook out of left field, and he's very involved in the intelligence agencies and has an intelligence background. He's reasonably well spoken. The reason why this is interesting that he's coming forward right now is there was, in 2023, there was something called the National Defense Authorization Act, which was passed, and that included whistleblower protections and exemptions to non-disclosure agreements for UFO whistleblowers. And that Defense Authorization Act in 2023 also mandates that the military review UFO sightings. And I believe there's some congressional tie-ins as well. And right now there is a congressional panel or some congressional task force that is reviewing UAP information. It's active in this. So theoretically, it would be a crime to withhold information from Congress if it's seeking it. What Grusch has done is he has placed himself under these new whistleblower protections. And what a whistleblower is, if you're not familiar with that term, it's somebody who is raising the alarm that something untoward is happening and somebody's trying to they're saying, I know from the inside something's going on that the public needs to know. I'm going to make it public. And there's a variety of whistleblower protections that say if somebody comes forward with information that they're not supposed to be retaliated against by their employer or by organizations. And this whistleblower protection stuff is specific to UFO activity or UAP activity. So this is kind of the first big case of somebody kind of raising their hand and saying, now that these protections are in place, I have something to say. And he was involved. I don't remember exactly how it was, but his interview was promoted by Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal. Those are the New York Times journalists who originally broke the UAP or the unidentified aerial phenomena with the Navy back in 2017. That was arguably kind of the resurgence of the UFO and UAP conversation in 2017, kind of bringing it to, for the first time really, or the first time in recent history, putting it on the front page or on the New York Times as a legitimate and valid topic. And since then, it's gained a lot of momentum. And now people are willing to publicly talk about UFOs, like Marco Rubio, and say, yeah, I've got people coming to me saying that they have, and not just random people, but I have people from intelligence communities coming to me saying that there's a lot of stuff going on that we don't know about. So what are the claims that these guys are making? Well, as Dan mentioned, Mr. Grusch is saying that he has seen information and evidence that he believes is valid and has heard from people in the community who he believes are trustworthy sources that there are non-man-made craft that have been recovered. He's gotten pretty specific in terms of there being at least 12 over some periods of time, craft that have been recovered, that there have been reverse engineering efforts by the US government and the Pentagon, as well as, and this is where it gets really creepy, depending on who you talk to, as well as a lot of private organizations. So in other words, there are private contractors to the government, whether it's Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or whomever, that have kind of taken over some of these things. And a lot of the analysis and reverse engineering and work that's being done on them is not really being done by the Pentagon. That's sort of the narrative that's rising to the top here, is that there's a lot of private work that's happening that is outside of Congress's knowledge, outside of the public's knowledge for sure, and really outside of the official channels. So this is bombshell stuff, depending on who you ask, because you've got a well-qualified person stating publicly to the media that there are craft, and he even also says that, according to his sources and the information he's seen, bodies that are non-human that have been recovered, and in one case, possibly a living body. So there's a lot of stuff like that. So why is this a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because it's mainstream. Nothing that he's saying, by the way, is in any way revolutionary to anybody who's been following this narrative for a long time. And many people are saying that makes him more likely to seem valid, because he's not saying anything that really changes the narrative for those who are interested in the narrative. So if you're an armchair ufologist or somebody who follows a UFO narrative, if you're part of MUFON or the Mutual UFO Network, if you know who the big UFO people are, and if you know all the abduction stuff, and if you can wax eloquently about Roswell, and you have strong opinions on UFOs and nuclear bases and these sorts of things that have come up in the past, and Randlesham Forest, and if you know what I'm talking about with all those things, then none of this stuff is new. But for Joe the plumber, or the little old lady down the street who's just watching the news, they may never have seen this before, at least, or if they've seen it, it's always been laughed off and mocked, and suddenly it's not. Now you've got major news organizations and senators and congresspeople talking in very serious tones about unidentified flying objects, unknown phenomena, alien craft, and alien bodies, or non-human craft, non-human bodies. The other phrase that's been coming up a lot with this whole conversation is non-human intelligence, which is not the same thing as artificial intelligence, which was our last episode. If you haven't heard our AI episode, that was the last topic we did. Go back and listen to that one. People seem to be appreciating it. But non-human intelligence means some other intelligence from some other source that is not a human source and not created by humans, while AI, is a human of origin, because we built the AIs. This would be something not built by humans. So in other words, an alien intelligence. They're just trying not to say the word alien when it comes to all this. So that's what's been going on. It's all over the place this month. And as Dan mentioned, and here we are, end of June of 2023. This was, I think, came out June 5th-ish, something like that. As Dan mentioned, it's picking up some momentum, and more people are coming forward. The question is this true, pure whistleblowing? Is this guy really saying everything he wants to say? Or is he being fed information? Or is this disinformation? Is this a psyop or a psychological operation by the intelligence agency? Are they trying to get the public to believe something? What's really going on here? Who's really behind it? Is he a legitimate and valid source? Should he be taken seriously at face value? Or should he be dismissed as just, another figure being offered up to the public to say some things that will get everybody, waving their hands in the air? What he has not done, and this is significant, he has not produced documents. He has not, WikiLeaked anything. There are no, hard drives of gigabytes or terabytes of data with a bunch of schematics and pictures and stuff. That he hasn't done anything like that. He's just come forward and said, this is what I know. There's no hard evidence behind any of it. He comes from a place of authority, so it's certainly worth taking what he says very seriously, but it's not the same thing as, as some of the whistleblowers, Julia is saying, and some of these people we've had in the past who have said, here's a whole bunch of ugly stuff that you're never supposed to see, and now it's public and the cat's out of the bag and we can never get it back into the bag. So it's a much more contained whistleblowing, I guess, in some ways. And some people are using that against him, and some people are still taking it seriously. So let's, Dan, I'll pass it back to you. Maybe just discuss a little bit of what, the pros and cons of what he's saying. And what I want to try to give to our audience is, what does Mr. Bible think about this? Not that there's an official position, but what's the discussion that we've been having a little bit behind the scenes with some of the co-hosts or people that of, who is this guy? Is he valid? Is he Is he somebody? What do you think about what he's saying? And you take it, we'll take it with a grain of salt. You can throw your opinions in there. And by the way, dear listeners, we reserve the right to be wrong on any of this. This stuff is developing quickly. It's obfuscated. There's a lot of misinformation, and we don't know where we're wrong. We're trying to match this stuff up with the biblical narrative and say, okay, based on what we know from Scripture, what makes sense, and how does that apply to the modern era? And it's a really, really hard task. It's really hard to untangle. So we certainly have thoughts and opinions and positions, but we're not telling you what to think. We're telling you some of what we've arrived at and some of what we've learned and some of what you should be considering or what we think you should be considering in some of these with some of these hard topics. But we're not saying that we have all the answers, because we just don't. There's no way to know. We can guess, we can speculate, we can wonder, we can believe, and I can believe something sincerely and turn out to be sincerely wrong. So just putting that out there. So Dan, feel free to share your thoughts, your opinions, stand on a soapbox if you want to and say, this is what it is. And here's what everybody should think about David Grusch. And if it turns out it's wrong, we won't hold it against you.
Yeah. Well, so I'm not going to take a real strong position because, I've been reading some different things about him, and people do tend to take strong positions. And really, with a lot of the stuff we've talked about in the podcast so far, it's stuff where people will often take a really strong position, but is often something that's ultimately speculation, which is, part of why we bring every episode back to Jesus, because that's where the speculation ends, and there's a real rock and truth that we can stand on. And so we'll do that again here. But as far as is this guy legit? I mean, his credentials seem to check out. The things he's saying are things that have been said before, as Joel mentioned. One article. So as much as this stuff is becoming mainstream and Congress is looking at it, there's still people, and I read an article this week about just talking about how the whole thing is just ridiculous and completely made up. And a couple of their major points was they were saying, if there's a race of beings out there with such advanced technology as would seem to be the case, that there's two big issues. One, there's no way we could reverse engineer anything. And so I look at that and I'm like, okay, on the one hand, yeah, maybe you couldn't really reverse engineer their software, but if, I don't know, it doesn't seem ridiculous to be able to reverse engineer certain parts of what they do, or technologies that they do, or materials that they have, and realizing that they're not materials that we have, and figuring it out. So to say that we could reverse engineer something that's significantly more advanced doesn't seem crazy on its surface. Another big issue they have is that if these crazy advanced vehicles that can go 20,000 miles an hour and turn on a dime and dive into water at high speed and not break apart, if they're this advanced, then why would they ever crash? And you're like, okay, that's a valid point. But as I was thinking about that, and some of the stuff we've talked about in the podcast with talking about how there is extraterrestrials in the Bible, as far as there's angels, which are by definition extraterrestrial and intelligent. So if there's good factions and bad factions out there, then having some crash once in a while does not seem crazy, because maybe they're not just crashing because of a malfunction, but maybe they're crashing because they're getting shot down by each other. So that also doesn't seem like something that would rule it out altogether in my mind. But as far as this particular whistleblower, I don't know. I haven't looked into it enough to form a really strong opinion. But where do you stand, Joel?
That's a good question. um, so I have a hard time separating this David Grusch situation from Lou Elizondo. For those of you who don't know, Lou Elizondo was almost a softer whistleblower version who came up, who went public not that long ago. I'm trying to think out loud of exactly when it was, probably late 2018, 2019, and started becoming really outspoken in 2020 and 2021. He was on the History Channel, and he was another guy. So yeah, I think in late 2020 is when he started to get really public. But Lou Elizondo was another guy who kind of came out of the intelligence apparatus of the U.S. and sort of put himself out there as, "Hey, I'm telling you, you guys all, I'm publicly saying a bunch of stuff that you're not really supposed to know." And he was saying this stuff on mainstream media. I mean, on Tucker Carlson, he said on live TV that the federal government has recovered crashed aircraft of non-human origins. So that's out there. That's in the zeitgeist. It's not so that's what I mean when I say this isn't new. This stuff has been said before. He didn't give as much detail, but he's been endlessly interviewed and promoted in History Channel and this and that. So to me, it feels a little bit similar because you have David Grusch, who is being a little bit more specific and a little bit more sensational, but comes somewhat from a similar background, maybe a little bit cleaner background in some ways. But he's just kind of going out and saying this stuff that, like I said, if anybody's been paying attention, it's been said. And the name that's been coming up more and more recently is the name Bob Lazar. If you don't know who Bob Lazar is, it's worth knowing if you're going to follow these topics at all. Bob Lazar was more of what I think a real whistleblower sounds and looks like. He claims that in the late 1980s, he was hired by the federal government to reverse engineer alien technology. He wrote a book about it called Dreamland. It's a good read. Read it. It's a good book. I enjoyed it. And he was a guy who was saying all this stuff, to use the hipster phrase. He was saying this before it was cool. I mean, he was saying this in I don't know when Dreamland was published. Sorry, I can try and pull that up. But he, by all intents, appears to be an extremely qualified guy as a physicist, and he was saying that they were reverse engineering alien technology. And he was saying, "Look, here's my job. Here's what I did. Here's where I was. Here's where I worked. Here's the places. Here's the locations. Here's the specific things we worked on." And it seemed like, as a whistleblower, Bob Lazar got completely trashed. His life went extremely downhill after he came out and said these things. All of his educational records appear to have been completely wiped out. So critics will say, "Oh, he has no education." Well, he sure seems to. He seems to know a lot of stuff, but you can't find his education records. You can't find his employment records. Everything's just gone. He's been arrested left, right, and center for a bunch of stuff that may or may not be criminal activity. He's been charged with stuff that was never really convicted of anything. And the stuff he was convicted of was kind of silly, like, "Oh, you were moving a substance from one state to another and you didn't have the right license and now you're a criminal." Stuff where, okay, yeah, follow the rules, but if you go pull up the guy's Wikipedia page, you're going to see, like, he's just, and Wikipedia, keep in mind, is a very very agenda-driven source. For those of you who don't know that, sorry to burst your bubble, but it is. And he's just shredded on Wikipedia and has been for a long time. However, more and more, it seems like the stuff he's been saying is true. And I have yet to see anybody definitively discredit Bob Lazar. And I've told people in the past in conversations about UFOs that I believe Bob Lazar. I think what he's saying is correct. Maybe I'm wrong. That's okay. But if I had to say yes or no to Bob Lazar, I would say yes. I think what he's saying is valid to as best as he can. But he was doing that back in the 80s, where being a true whistleblower meant taking real risks. I'm looking at Lou Elizondo and David Grusch and saying, what risk exactly are they taking? David Grusch is retired. Now he's a household name and everybody wants to talk to him. He's not gone to, and maybe it's because of the whistleblower protections, but the guy, he hasn't gone to jail. He hasn't been, as far as I know, he's not hiding under a rock and, with a security detail somewhere. He just seems pretty casual and relaxed. similar to Lou Elizondo, who became, a UFO celebrity through his, and probably got, as far as I can tell, probably a lot of good paying gigs, and is probably a consultant on any project he wants to be in this entire space. And yet they're claiming to be saying a bunch of stuff that extremely powerful organizations don't want them to say. So that makes me skeptical. Say it seems like they have some level of permission to be getting away with saying the things that people that they're saying, and it seems like it's not as upsetting to the sources that they're claiming. And so so that leads me to conclude that, or leads me to suspect, I can't conclude, but it leads me to suspect that there's a high degree of intentionality behind these whistleblowing claims. That doesn't mean that they're completely false. It doesn't mean that everything David Grusch is saying is wrong. Like I said, it lines up. It actually verifies the same narrative that Bob Lazar was saying, and I do believe Lazar. So I do believe a lot of the stuff that David Grusch is saying. But what I am extremely suspicious of are the conclusions that are being drawn from it and the spin that's being put on it, because it's feeding very much into the narrative of extraterrestrials, Darwinian evolved extraplanetary forces, just this whole ET alien thing of, these are aliens from other planets that are affecting the human species, and it's kind of like we're poising for this big leap forward, but there's this threat out there, and I'm suspicious. I think that the narrative behind it all is probably being extremely manipulated, because biblically, I don't think that's what's going on. I think these are of very old origin. I think this stuff is much closer to home. I think there probably was some interplanetary involvement once upon a time, although probably not currently, because that war seems to have happened a long time ago, and there seems to be a lot of dead planet activity out there in our solar system. And as far as I know, other solar systems, I don't know. I mean, I've said before, when you look biblically, it's when the Bible, especially the Old Testament, when it talks about the heavens, it talks about them as though they're alive. And I don't think that's purely symbolic. I think there's literally living forces and non-human intelligences that are identified with the heavens. And you've heard that if you've been listening to this for any time. But it's not the ET narrative. It's not little green men from some distant planet have discovered us and are showing up to either be enemies or friends, and there might be another species from another planet. I think that stuff is really, really convenient if you're part of the defense apparatus. It's really convenient if you are peddling the Darwinian narrative, and it's really convenient if you want to set up consolidation of a singular world government under a proposed alien threat. And I think that is probably more accurately described biblically as the Antichrist period that I think we're approaching. And I think the idea of an alien threat is a really convenient idea. So I'm not saying David Grusch or Lou Elizondo are, Antichrist puppets or anything like that, but I am saying that the fact that this singular narrative seems to be demonstrated and reinforced, and then you go back to you do take that in the context of some of the laughable stuff that was going on with the Chinese spy balloons a while back, and we're shooting them down with these 1970s missiles, and maybe they're UFOs, and by the way, there's no debris, and nobody has any idea where they are. So that story just completely disappeared after a little while. I don't sound like I'm putting on my tinfoil hat as we speak, but we have to put all this into context. We have to look at the bigger, like what is going on? How is the zeitgeist shifting? What is being fed to media consumers in the US, and what's being told? Well, there's a few common things. One is that there are, highly advanced species not from Earth, and that they've been involved with Earth but are ahead of us, but we've been trying to catch it behind the scenes, and all the secrecy and lies have been for your own good. So that's one thing, that we've been trying to catch up on this technology so that we can defend Earth because there's a threat, and it's might be a non-human threat, but we don't really know. Meanwhile, please don't be upset with the fact that we've been extracting money to the private sector probably to the tune of trillions upon trillions of dollars to do this, that there may be extremely advanced technologies that could have been real nice for humanity to have had for a long time that haven't been disclosed, that there are probably a very small group of people who have consolidated a tremendous amount of wealth and power as a result of these things. But please ignore all that, because this is all for your own good. And if you will just let us be in charge, we'll save you from the threat. So that's a little bit of a rant there, but that's the narrative that's being put together. That's the narrative you see from kind of To the Stars Academy or TTSA, and so who Lou Elizondo has worked with, and again, we don't have time to go into and unpack all that stuff. But so there's a secular narrative that's being very carefully detailed around all this, and I become really suspicious of any quote unquote whistleblower who's just feeding exactly into that. Even if the facts are accurate, what they mean, I don't think is necessarily accurate, because we're always going to come back to the biblical perspective. And the biblical perspective is there's nothing that's outside the purview of the Creator, and that this conflict between non-human beings has been going on for a very long time, and that to some extent humanity is at the center of it. And there's a reason that God became human, and that there's something very high stakes happening around the planet Earth and around humanity, and that we're largely ignorant to main portions of it, but we're not ignorant to Christ, and Christ is going to be the answer and going to be the victor in all this. I get a lot more interested when I hear whistleblowers or researchers saying, the really weird thing about this is the supernatural stuff that we really can't explain. It's not just how does a craft make a 90-degree turn at 4,000 miles an hour. There are physics that can explain that, and you have to warp space-time to do it, and that's what's been claimed all along. Bob Lazar's been saying that for a long time, and so have many other researchers and other people. But what the more interesting stuff is when people start finding stuff that really kind of lines up with the biblical narrative, and it becomes a much more spiritually eerie discussion at that point. And that's where I think that's what's really going on. I think there's a high elements of demonic, satanic activity, but also some, servants of the Most High God that are involved in these sorts of things. And by the way, none of that is anything new. It's been going on for thousands of years, but it seems to be coming to the surface in some ways. I think it's not unrelated to the rise of satanic and occult worship in Hollywood and in the major influence centers, and the open Satanism that we're seeing. If you're, as you've heard us talk about in other things, I think that's going to continue. I heard, and Dan, you know what I'm referring to, and then I'll be quiet for a minute and let you share any additional thoughts. I heard an former intelligence operative being interviewed on this very subject, and there was a section of the interview that was really, really eerie, because what he said, I realized as I was listening to it, is this is a preview of Antichrist rhetoric. This is what we're listening to, because this is what this guy said. Now, this is a guy who comes out of the intelligence community. He was speaking about these things, and he was dismissing David Grusch and Lou Elizondo as basically puppets. And he wasn't dismissing the topics by any means. He was saying, no, these guys are puppets. They're manipulated. That's his opinion, and he's entitled to it. And what he was saying is there's absolutely advanced intelligences out there, and there is a conflict going on, and he has reasons from his own experience and sources to believe this. And maybe we'll link to the interview if I can find a good clean link for it. But then he went on to say something that I was chilling. And I don't think he meant it to be, but for Christians, it should be very chilling. What he said was something along the lines of, the big crying tragedy here is that religious nuts are going to manipulate this conversation. And when we have non-human intelligences show up, then somebody's going to say, oh, those are from heaven. And you're going to have people who will betray their species and betray their country because they're going to think that extraterrestrial they're seeing is in the name of Jesus or is from something that they've been told in Sunday school is heaven. And those people are going to be holding back humanity, and that's just a terrible tragedy that there's going to be all these clueless, brainless idiots that are getting manipulated by this stupidity of religion to not really see what's going on. And I'm listening to this guy who's a very well-spoken and highly informed guy, and going, oh, wow, I guess that's what we got to be prepared for, is if and when something shows up, and it's not an if, it is a when. Scripturally, it says it's a when non-human entities are on the scene, and some of them are at conflicting agendas with others. And biblically, we can identify who's who and say, this one seems to be on the side of Christ, and that one seems to be Antichrist. Well, the secular narrative is how pathetic that these religious losers think this has anything to do with their scripture, when really this is about the advancement of the human species, and your religion is stupid. And it's frustrating and sad and shocking and upsetting that that's probably what we should be expecting. That we're going to be the weirdos saying, hey guys, this is in the Bible, it's right here, and it's all there, and it's been very clearly forecasted. Now Alberino, we're talking about, I'm mentioning Alberino because we are going to get a little bit into the Birthright conversation, but he asserts that the closer we get to the end, then there's going to be the rise of what he's coined apotheotheism, which is not an atheism. It's not that there is no God, but it's this kind of redefining as man can become like God. So it's going to feel very secular and very religious at the same time, because it's going to be talking about the ascension of man and how man becomes self-serving and throws off this concept of God. And it's very possible that what we think of as God and Jesus and angels are just going to be, are going to be positioned as, well, no, that's just the enemy invading alien force. And we don't like those guys because they're trying to put us in all kinds of behavioral and moral handcuffs, and we need to follow these other guys over here. They have our real best interests in mind, and the people who are saying that are going to be following the Antichrist. So the Christ and the Antichrist. You're either following Christ or you're following something else, which is Antichrist. So I'm floating that out there because that's the kind of conversations that are being had right now. And then again, a few years ago, that was not mainstream stuff, and now it is. So David Grusch, I think it's very convenient. I don't think he's wrong. He may be sincere, but the fact that his life seems to be getting better as a result of, and his situation seems to be improving as a result of apparently, claiming to go against extremely powerful authorities, I find that very suspicious. Maybe it's true that our Congress and this Whistleblower Protection Act is just that good. It could be. I just kind of doubt it. So I believe that there's some level of manipulation behind this. That doesn't mean that we should ignore what he's saying. I think it's still a really, really big freaking deal that the mainstream news is carrying stories for the first time in most of our lifetimes about the validity of UFOs, of non-human craft, and of non-human bodies, and reverse engineering of technology, and taking those things very seriously. That's something, that level of disclosure, to use the pop term for in the ufologist field, that level of disclosure was something that many people thought would not happen for a very, very long time. But here we are. The question is, what does it mean, and what are they trying to do with it? So, Dan, I'll step aside for a moment and let you add any final thoughts there, and then we can move along to the. We can stay here as long as you want. The recording's free, but if you want to share anything, and I'll window dress it if I come up with anything. Otherwise, we can move along to the Alberino discussion when you're ready.
Yeah, one final thought here is you'd mentioned quickly about the push towards a one world government that this would help with. And, there's been studies before done to, figure out what would it take to really create a one world government. And one of the things you really need for that is a common enemy that the world would have to band together to fight or overcome. One of those common enemies is the climate. Another popular common enemy is some sort of alien invasion that you have to band together to take on. So, that's it. It's convenient, and a one world government is another thing that's being talked about. Like nobody's even trying to hide it. That is an agenda for a powerful group of people out there, and that is part of the goal.
Well, it's not just, and it's been very thoroughly previewed. In 1987, Ronald Reagan said that in front of the UN. And he basically said, I think we'd find that we have a lot fewer differences and we could all unite globally if there was some sort of alien threat that became public. And there's a lot of people picking apart those words saying, what did he know? Because presumably he knew some things, because there was a lot going on in the 1980s around this stuff. But he said that in front of the UN, and some people would say he was wishing for it. I don't think he was wishing for it so much as he was acknowledging something that he knew to be true. But that just wasn't the time that was being enacted.
Yeah, but I'd say we can move on to Birthright.
And by the way, this stuff is not in any way, these topics are not divorced. I think it's interesting how frequently this stuff is current. I've had people contacting me who I know about Mystery Bible and are saying, boy, you must feel like a genius because everything you're talking about is suddenly all over the news. And the funny thing is, like, it hadn't even crossed my mind. It was just like, well, I feel like I've been saying this stuff for a long time. I know Dan's been hearing me rant about it for years, and it's because other people have been saying it, and I've been, following them and learning from them. And so it doesn't feel new. It feels almost inevitable. But it's interesting to keep in mind that there are plenty of people out there who have never really thought about this before. And really just in the last couple of years, it's the first time it's ever crossing their mind that maybe there's a such thing as a non-human intelligence out there, or maybe there is a such thing as an extraterrestrial. And what would that be? And then suddenly going, the Bible kind of says that, and you get these light bulb moments, and then there's a UFO headline, and it's it feels like a complete paradigm shift. And I'm not downplaying that at all. I've thought several times recently of I'm going to pull up the verse here so I don't get it wrong. If you bear with me. When you look at the verse in the Bible, specifically from Daniel, I think it's right around chapter 12. Oh, it's Daniel. There's a prophecy that Daniel sees in Daniel chapter 12. And he is told to shut up and seal that book. And he's told by God to seal it until the time of the end, where many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. That's a marker of the time of the end. And he says the book should be shut up until then. I don't know what book it is, and I'm not sure specifically what that's referring to. But that phrase of "and knowledge shall increase" at the end is a phrase that has been kind of gonging around in my head and, off and on for the last several weeks. It's like there are a lot of people's eyes that are opening right now. And I wonder if this is the kind of knowledge increase we're talking about, where suddenly there's a huge swath of society that's suddenly going, oh, wait, we're not the only thing here. There's a lot more going on out there. And there's a subset of that swath of society that's saying, man, this really looks a lot like what the Bible's been talking about. It feels like knowledge is increasing. It feels like my knowledge is increasing. I feel like I'm, dramatically more cognizant to these things and reading my Bible differently than I was reading it 5 years ago. And I think I would argue better. I think I have a much better understanding of the major themes of Scripture than I had several years ago. And I think it's not because of studying UFOs. It's just that UFOs start to make a lot more sense when you understand your Bible. So it's because of studying the Bible and taking the Bible seriously, and the stuff that we talk about here, like the Heiser stuff, and just going down the rabbit holes, and going on a kick that I did for a while of not reading anything unless it's at least 3,000 years old, and trying to get back in touch with that stuff, which is exactly where we're going with the Alberino discussion tonight. That suddenly we're going, I feel like my knowledge has really increased, and I feel like I understand what's going on with humanity and human history and what the Bible is trying to tell us about these things, I feel like I have a much, much better understanding of it. Now, I don't think I'm the only one. I feel like many people are getting that understanding, and we're trying to share that and increase it. And I just, that phrase, knowledge shall increase, just keeps coming back to me over and over from Daniel chapter 12, 12:4 is what I found when I looked it up just now. So, Dan, I don't know if you relate to that or have any similar comments on that, but it really, really feels like there's some kind of shift going on, and the spotlight of things that are extremely relevant to Scripture in the end times is just so much brighter than it was even a few years ago. And if you disagree, let me know. I don't think you do, but anything to add there, and then we'll launch into Alberino.
Yeah, well, I mean, all along, like Scripture's been clear that God's existence is clear just by looking around. And I think just the way the world is going, it seems like battle lines are being drawn more and more. There's more and more just kind of undeniable stuff. I mean, you have things like people on national TV blatantly worshiping Satan. You have mainstream stores like Target having selling apparel designed by Satan worshipers, and so it's a crazy time with knowledge increasing, with knowledge about things that seemed like conspiracy theories now just being thrown in your face, and yeah, it's a crazy time.
Yeah, it is a time to be alive, and I have no idea what the world's going to look like in 3 years or 5 years, but I firmly believe that it's going to look very different than it looks now, but I don't know exactly how, because it's all changing so quickly. Some things will look the same, and I'm also remembering a lot of what Jesus says, where he says, at the end, it'll be like the days of Noah. They will be marrying and giving in marriage, and now I have a lot more specific thoughts on who's going to be marrying who, and or who's going to be marrying what, and marrying and giving in marriage. Basically, there's going to be all kinds of celebration, and it's going to be this age of prosperity in one way. But another way there, and this is again relevant to our discussion tonight, another way that golden age of prosperity was the age that demarcated the period right before the flood, right before the disaster, where God said, no, this is not what I have in mind for humanity. So that brings us to Timothy Alberino's book, Birthright. We, in our discussion so far, we've covered 8 chapters-ish, so that we're going to dive into chapter 9, which is titled Atlantis Rising, depending on the copy you have, whether it's a physical copy or an ebook copy. In my physical copy, it's on page 169. For those of you who haven't followed us, we've been going through Timothy Alberino's book, Birthright. It's there's a whole series on it. I encourage you to go back and listen. It's a little hard to jump into right in the middle. We'd love to get Timothy Alberino as a guest sometime. He's an interesting author in this space. We've covered many other books and many other authors, but we've been using this one as a particular deep dive just to drive this narrative forward. We're not saying that we agree with every single thing he says, although I think I agree with a lot of things he says. And we're certainly not saying that, this is some new doctrinal foundation. It's not. And he certainly wouldn't say that either. But it's a really helpful book for thinking through the extraterrestrial questions and the end times and all this stuff from a biblical perspective. It was published in 2020, and he continues to be very active in the lectures and podcasts and stuff like that. And there are many other good books too. Just go through our episode list, and there are many books in there that we have discussed or mentioned or done episodes on that can also be really, really helpful. And there are more to come. So that being said, when we get into chapter 9, then it kind of kicks off. So the chapter is called Atlantis Rising, but that's not where he starts. The chapter doesn't begin with talking about Atlantis. The chapter begins with talking about the idea of catastrophism. And we've talked about this a little bit before. And what catastrophism, so when you think about human history, you can divide 2 major schools of thought, not just human history, but history of the earth. When you think about the history of our Earth, you can split into 2 major schools of thought. One of them is uniformism, uniformitarianism. Let's go ahead and make the word longer. That's the official word, not uniformism, but uniformitarianism. There's this idea of uniformitarianism, and that the phrase you always hear is the present informs the past. We look at the way the world is today, and we project it backward evenly to understand what the past was like. Then the opposite school is catastrophism, which is you look at the past to understand why the present looks the way it does. And the two differences are the uniformitarianism kind of starts with, well, everything has been mostly the way it is for a very long time, and over very long periods of time, then there have been some changes in that, and it's time and slow grinding change that allow for Darwinian evolution and all these other things that really explain why the world looks the way it does today on a geological level, on a fossil level, on a biological level. All that comes from these eons upon eons of slow, steady shifting, and millions and tens of millions, in some cases hundreds of millions, and if we need billions of years, we'll throw some billions in there to kind of get to today. And that's the way everything looked, and it's only been slow grinding ever since, or as far back as you go. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's uniformitarianism. That is the prevailing academic secular mindset. And we'll talk about why that is shortly. The other side of that conversation is catastrophism. And what catastrophism says is there have been extremely violent upheavals that have completely reshaped and twisted the planet and completely interrupted or disrupted species development and planetary development and all these things. Whether evolutionarily or not, like there were times where there were times not so long ago, not millions of years ago, but maybe tens of thousands of years ago, where the world looked completely different. And then there were huge upheavals in between. And there are lots of theories about what those are that completely changed everything. And that is not to the secular narrative, and in fact, the secular academic side of the aisle, for whatever reason, and again, like I said, we'll discuss it, but they hate that narrative because it calls into question the whole evolutionary concept. But catastrophism versus uniformitarianism, and Dan, I'll hand it over to you to give your commentary and thoughts on that, and what Alberino, the point Alberino is trying to make in the early parts of this chapter 9.
Yeah, so he starts out basically just talking about the flood and how the flood has really been an accepted and known part of history until very recently. And so he talks about the idea of geological uniformitarianism was really not even an idea until the year 1830, when this geologist Charles Lyell published a book where that was his theory that he was going off of. And then
to put Charles that in perspective, Darwin, by the way, Darwin was 1859, I think, is when Origin of Species came out.
Yeah, so Darwin was a big fan of Lyell because basically both of these theories needed vast amounts of time to even begin to make sense. And you get rid of the biblical flood, it starts to open up some of those ideas a little more. So part of what that does is really an effort to undo the whole biblical narrative, like to get rid of the flood and say no, there wasn't really a flood, and there wasn't creation. It was just, this has all just happened slowly and gradually over millions and billions of years. But so the very first part of this chapter is about just how much the flood was just an understood part of humanity, and that there's flood stories there's hundreds of flood stories from all over the world, all sorts of different cultures, and it wasn't really ever called into question until 1830.
There's a quote that I underline on page 172 that says, "Before Lyell, or Lyell, It's Lyell, and he wrote the book he wrote is called Principles of Geology, and that's that book, 1830. Before Lyell, the doctrine of catastrophism was universally accepted as plain fact. Today, it is roundly rejected in the scientific community, not because it has been refuted. Indeed, evidence in support of the doctrine mounts by the day, but because it undermines the theory of evolution and is therefore regarded with contempt. So, that really captures kind of the first part of what this is about. The point that Alberino is making is every culture for all known history of humankind and prehistory of humankind agrees that there were major catastrophes, and they all seem to overlap on this idea of the flood. And that seemed to be a pretty good reason to take that seriously. Not to mention, there's a tremendous amount of geological evidence that if you, and I'm not trying to sound like a jerk when I say this, but like if you're intellectually honest and open-minded about what the world looks like and what some of the geological history or what some of the geological evidence looks like, catastrophism just rises to the top. It really, really, really looks like the Earth went through some brutal events that included massive forces of sudden deluges of water at one point. And that's not discussed in the book, but there's all kinds of evidence for that secular geologists just have a really hard time explaining. There are things like bent layers of crust in the earth. It's just stuff that should not form over time, but would have to be wet and soft and form very quickly and harden. You have the entire fossil record, or the entire geological stack is in sediment. And sediment is layers of rock that are set down by water. Then you get the idea of the whole fossil record. You get these fossils that are in places where they shouldn't be, and fossils that are preserved in extremely rapid states that shouldn't be possible. You have woolly mammoth fossils in Siberia that were literally, or not just fossils, but frozen specimens of woolly mammoths that were frozen with food in their mouths. We have fossils of dinosaurs in the act of giving birth, and yet uniformitarianism would say no, fossils take tens of thousands of years to form, but they ignore things like fossils, fossilized forests that happened within a matter of years after the eruption of Mount St. Helens. They ignore the fact that we found fossils of everything from miners' hats to teddy bears. They ignore things like the carbon dating of coal seams being identical around the world, and there's no reason they should all match to the same time frame, but they do. And carbon dating in and of itself has some issues because it kind of has to assume that certain things have been extremely uniform over a period of time, and that's, to some extent, that's very helpful. But there's another extent where you have to make a lot of assumptions around it. So we have all kinds of things, and I've just rattled off a few that I could think of off the top of my head. There's a cave in Maryland where you've got a whole bunch of bones of animals that should be from different periods that are all jumbled up together. And then I was at the Grand Canyon recently, and it just doesn't make sense when you stand at the Grand Canyon, look at it. Your eyes don't tell you that that little tiny green ribbon of Colorado River down there just did this over millions of years. You look around, you're like, this really looks like something really big happened a while ago. And there's some really weird stuff about the Grand Canyon too that doesn't get talked about a lot. Did you know there are no dinosaur bones in the Grand Canyon? No dinosaur fossils? None. Never found one in the Grand Canyon. The human history there is very, very strange. It's very hard to follow and doesn't seem to line up with other things with the areas. And the Grand Canyon is just one example. There are many canyons and many rivers that have river beds that are way wider than that river should rightfully have. Then you have other fossils that are really hard to explain, like fossilized footprints, even human footprints. And we all know that if you or I go step in the mud, it's not there several years later. That's not how it works, especially if you're in an area where there's a lot of water. It disappears quickly, yet we have fossilized footprints. So what that tells us is these fossilization things happen a lot more rapidly than we think, and it has a lot more to do with the circumstances of what's going on than with this really crazy time period. So I know I'm being a little disjointed and a little jumbled as I'm attacking this idea of uniformitarianism, but what Alberino is trying to say in the early part of this chapter is that catastrophism has always been the common sense explanation, and it's supported by all the prehistoric cultures and the historic cultures until suddenly, right around the 1830s, you had these guys say, no, we're going to go with a completely different narrative. All those prehistoric cultures were a bunch of fools. They don't know anything. And we're just going to say that we're the apex of, that we humans are the apex of millions and millions of years of evolution and hundreds of thousands of years of human and Homo sapien development. We're going to make no effort to explain what was going on for tens of thousands of years. And we're just going to say that it's all just been this slow grind. And the good news is we can throw out the Bible. We can throw out the creation concept. We can throw out any, in any religion that has history to it. We can throw all that out and say it's all science, science, science. And we're going to codify that in the American institutions. And anybody who disagrees with it is not going to be taken seriously as any kind of scholar whatsoever. And that's what happened starting in the mid 1800s, the middle of the 19th century, especially with Darwin. And it became this narrative that was just forced onto the Western public. And many of us who have been around for a little while, like, it's easier today to question evolution than it was 20 years ago. You look at Graham Hancock's recently, and that guy's been flayed and raked over the coals quite a bit, but he had a Netflix series recently that is not biblical. Well, you could say it's very biblical, but he doesn't acknowledge that it's biblical, that really calls into question the whole uniformitarianism concept and makes the case that there at one point was a very advanced civilization on Earth that was destroyed in some kind of catastrophe. Again, very relevant to our conversation tonight. So he makes a really good case for it. And I've listened to, I don't have Netflix, so I haven't seen that particular documentary, but I've listened to a lot of Graham Hancock stuff and read a lot of his stuff, and I know what he's about, and I know the kind of things that he says and the case that he makes, and I've seen some clips of it. So I feel like I'm speaking with some authority that I know where he's coming from with it. And I think he makes a really good case for it. The fact that that's even on a major network and available is a coup. That wouldn't have happened many years ago, a decade ago. It just would have been shouted down and shut down. And he's been through plenty. But and Dan, maybe you can speak to it. What do you think? My daughter, when I was mentioning what we were discussing tonight, she said, and she has some really wonderful teachers. But when I mentioned, we're going to be talking about catastrophism, she's going into the 7th grade. She goes, we spent a whole month on catastrophism and uniformitarianism and all the evidence for catastrophism in school. I was like, what? I was like the weird kid in the back calling out objections and getting shouted down by the teacher, like back in, the Answers in Genesis days, where it was like, hey, if you don't accept this Darwinian theory, you're a bozo. And that's what I grew up with. And the fact that she's in a public school and maybe it's unique to her teacher, it seems like the Darwinian narrative is coming apart a little bit and is more easily to be called into question, probably for nefarious purposes, so that we can enter into, our one world government and new UFO overlords, UAP overlords at this point. And I'm saying that tongue in cheek, but there seems to be some kind of shift going on. But for a long, long time, it's been uniformitarianism. So that's my rant. I can stop there, but Dan, feel free to add or move us forward, since I'm getting heated up now.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how something was accepted for so long, and then all of a sudden this new idea comes along, and it so hijacked the academic world and in turn our culture that, what...
You mean when uniformitarianism came along,
right?
It became the only way to think.
Right. For thousands of years, people just accepted the flood and knew that the flood happened. And then all of a sudden, someone says, no, it's this other way. And then the culture and the academic world falls in line with it, so much to the degree that people who disagree with it or try to say something like catastrophism get shut down, will lose their jobs, fear for their jobs. You mentioned Graham Hancock just getting completely torn apart and discredited. and cut down because of the things he's saying. And the things he's saying make a whole lot more sense than the academic line that's being towed.
Yeah, he's not spouting nonsense. He's pointing out some really, really thoughtful things that are there, and he's pointing out evidence that a lot of archaeologists and geologists just refuse to look at because it completely upends. I mean, anytime something like that comes up where there's some bit of evidence that just goes, well, now we have a problem, then it just gets swept away. And one of the things that we'll throw out there is the existence of Göbekli Tepe. If you don't know what Göbekli Tepe is, it's the ruins of a very advanced city in Turkey that is absolutely datable to a time well before any city should be there, according to secular archaeology. I'm going to pull it up right now. Göbekli Tepe. Isn't the internet a wonderful thing when you need it? It's in Anatolia, and what I'm trying to get is the date. It seems like it was abandoned at least between 9,000 and 8,000 BC. So we're talking, 10 to 12,000 years ago. There was this very, very advanced city, and it is extremely advanced, the way it's set up and built, and it's megalithic and just stuff that all secular archaeologists up until recently would have had to say was not possible, couldn't exist, because mankind didn't know how to make those things at that time, because we hadn't followed our evolutionary path far enough, and we were, and that's way, but it's there. And it's not the only one. There are many, many more too, but that's just an undeniable ones. And I know Graham Hancock talks about that quite a bit as like, well, now you've got Göbekli Tepe, and it's a real problem if you are, a secular uniformitarianist. So, sorry, Dan, I kind of jumped in there, but I'm trying to make this as practical, give people things to hang their hats on or rabbit holes to go down on their own time. But the point I was making is Graham Hancock has been, as you were saying, Dan, shredded and publicly eviscerated. Now, the guy's also got a Netflix show, so I'm sure he's not hurting too badly. But he's been
that was a long time
raked
coming
over the course. Yes. I mean, he's been. If you go to his Wikipedia page again, like Bob Lazar, his Wikipedia page is resemblant of Bob Lazar, of just calling everything into question, and his very worth as a human being and whether or not his brain works is all called into question on his Wikipedia page. When he's a contrarian, he's a guy who looks at things and says, maybe it's not what everybody is telling me it is. I'll throw out a quick story for this since I'm on a roll here. Many years ago, well, not that many years ago, circa 2010, which is weird that that's 13 years ago. I was studying venture capital in Israel, and I was able to spend some weeks in Israel, and I wasn't there for what I wanted to be there for. It would have been, biblical studies, and that's super. And I hope to get back there to do some of that. But I had the great opportunity to spend time there and get to know their venture capital and business scene, and really, really good experience. I took a whole course there, and while I was there, I was able to do some sightseeing. And one of the things we did is I and a few others went over to went across the border of Jordan and went over to see the city of Petra, the ancient city of Petra. And if you don't know what Petra is, you've seen it. It's in some of the Indiana Jones movies. It's in some of the Transformers movies. It's just this incredible city that is carved out of rock, just stunning, stunning architecture. And it's in the middle of this desert. And the funny thing about it is there's not really any good explanation for why it's there, because it's one of those things, a little bit like Göbekli Tepe, that is extremely inconvenient for the narrative. And so I'm standing, me being the contrarian that I am. I wasn't trying to be contrary. I'm going through this guided tour of Petra, and just using my own eyeballs, it's easy to tell that what the tour guide is saying is impossible. So we're looking, and Petra is a lot bigger than people think it is. It's actually, I think, hundreds of acres. It's not just like a couple of buildings. I wandered after I left the tour. I wandered around and found more. And I mean, I was just crawling over these ancient ruins that were not roped off and kind of like not even inside they were easy to get to. There's just nobody there. So while we're standing there, we're looking at these ornate buildings carved into rock. And I'm looking at one, and the one on the left looks very new, and the one on the right looks like it's had about 1,000 years of weathering on it. and and they're literally 2 meters apart from each other. And you're just looking at them side by side, and one of them is clearly way older than the other, just because it's faded, it's water damaged over time, and they're in the same hillside. And I'm listening to the tour guide who's saying, "Oh yeah, these were all built between this very narrow time range." So I'm the jerk who raises my hand. I'm like, "Wait a second, why does this one look so much older than the other one? This one looks like it's been here for eons. The other one looks like it's, maybe 1,000 years old. But this thing, if that's 1,000 years old, this other thing looks like it's 10,000 years old. It just looks like it's been here so much longer." And after, and some of the stuff was just, I was asking just very innocent questions like, and his answer to that was local weather patterns. Like, well, how local is your weather? These things are 3 meters from each other, and this one has been decimated by wind and rain, and the other one looks basically brand new in comparison. So, after raising my hand a handful of times through the tour guide actually said, "I'm going to need you to stop asking questions because you're really, and I wasn't being, a jerk about it. I was literally expecting that they would have some good answers for some of this stuff. And I was just asking my curiosity questions. And the guy basically was like, your ignorance is ruining everybody's time. And it was really like this shocking thing. And I was there with a couple of my classmates, and one of them was like, geez, like this tour guide got really hostile. It was like, you need to sit down and shut up and not ask any more questions. And because I was just pointing out stuff that just, I thought was like, well, isn't everybody wondering this? And maybe they were, but I was the only one who was willing to say it. And there were several things like where he said, oh, there's this area over here is a cemetery, but there was an aqueduct. So I just said, why do they have an aqueduct in the cemetery? And he's like, shut up, it's there. Okay, I just wanted to know. Or he said this other area never had any residents in it, but there's an amphitheater. Like, well, what's the amphitheater for if nobody was here? Like, what were they doing? What did they do with the amphitheater? And he's like, well, we don't know if that's an amphitheater. Like, well, I'm looking at it. It's definitely an amphitheater. I'm not sure what else it would be. What do you think it is? And he's like, you got to stop asking questions. Your ignorance is ruining everybody's time, and basically kicked me off the tour. So that's my when I think of Graham Hancock, I'm like, it's like that guy's just had that response for decades, professionally and personally. I got a little taste of it. Like, how dare you ask these questions about the accepted narrative of this place? And I'm just looking around going, that narrative just doesn't seem to make sense with what seems obvious to my ignorant eyeballs as I look around me. I'm just trying to fit it together and wonder what's going on. And I was really shocked by the hostility. It was a hostile response. And so, I tucked that away, and there's a very real hostility to this stuff. So that's the difference between catastrophism and uniformitarianism is when you question for whatever reason, when Lyell and Darwin brought up a completely contrarian idea that was totally in the face of the normal narrative, which was which had some supernatural elements, had a biblical flood, and all these things that was so accepted. Somehow they were wholeheartedly accepted and brought into the secular narrative as this is what will be taught from now on, and there will be no questioning of it for a long time. And I think today that's shifting a little bit. So, Dan, I'll step out of the way again. I know you were saying some things, but that got me on a rabbit trail.
Yeah, you're good. Well, I mean, one more quick comment on Graham Hancock. It's interesting when you listen to him. If you were just listening to snippets of what he says, you could think he was talking about Birthright, or you could think about talking about things that we've talked about on the show. But he's seeing a lot of the same things, but he does not have the same worldview. He's, if anything, I might say anti-Christian.
Yeah, he's pretty hostile towards religion in general.
Yeah. But, still he's seeing a lot of the same things. There's times where I listen to him talk and I'm like, do you not hear yourself speaking? Like, you are describing the Bible right now. And, but he doesn't acknowledge that whatsoever, for what that's worth.
Dan, I'm going to put you on the spot. Can you talk a little bit at all about the Younger Dryas impact theory, which is not and the reason I'm bringing it up, well, you know why I'm bringing it up, but for the audience's benefit, the reason I'm bringing it up is I know that this is something that, as Dan pointed out to me, is actually footnoted in this book, in the Birthright book, but is not really explicitly called out. But if you listen to the more recent material from Timothy Alberino, then he goes into tremendous detail and clearly has been on a kick of the Younger Dryas impact theory explains a lot of things. And it's also something that Graham Hancock talks about quite a bit. I'm not saying they follow each other. I have no idea. But the point is, this theory is gaining more and more momentum. And in 2020, when this book was published, it was a footnote. And now I think if Timothy Alberino was writing this, there'd probably be a whole chapter on it, would be my guess based on some of what I've seen from him recently. So what's the Younger Dryas impact theory, as you understand it, and what does it have to do with this flood narrative?
Well, I'll just read that footnote, and that might give
Sure,
some clarity.
go for it. Yeah.
It says, it is becoming increasingly evident that the surface of the planet was reshaped by a cataclysmic flood about 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, called the Younger Dryas, when ice sheets in the northern hemisphere suddenly melted. So, it's basically describing a global cataclysmic flood that would have just had a hugely destructive force on the Earth, and melting ice sheets, and a period of lots of volcanic activity and explosions. And there's theories that it's meteors raining down, and there's a lot more to it than that, but that's surface level.
Yeah, exactly. And thank you for breaking those things up. So the impact theory specifically is that right around 12,800-ish years ago, then there was a point where the planet Earth passed through the tail of a comet, and there were several chunks of that comet that impacted Earth and hit probably in the ice sheet areas, the Arctic ice sheet areas, and these would have been devastating level impacts. I don't mean extinction level, but they would have been the equivalent of many nuclear weapons going off simultaneously, and they would have shaken up the atmosphere, superheated sections of it. And by the way, this explains the reason the theory is gaining momentum is because it really, really explains a lot of things that uniformitarianism doesn't explain, like how you have whole entire herds of woolly mammoths frozen in seconds in certain parts of the world, while you have superheating of other parts of the world. So the theory basically says that there was an impact of multiple fragments of comet, probably over a pretty short period of time, meaning maybe days or weeks, possibly years, but probably shorter than that, as the Earth passed through this section of comet. And the reason why that's alarming is because comets are cyclical, and so is the Earth's orbit. So some people are saying that we're due to pass through it again, and some of that is lines up quite well with some of the ancient accounts. There's a lot of ancient historical documentation around this stuff, one of which is Plato. Plato talks about an advanced civilization that in his Crition writings, he talks about an advanced civilization that was wiped off the earth in a catastrophe that occurred 12,800 years ago, pretty much to the exact same point of time. And so, and that advanced civilization is Atlantis, which will kind of bring us to our next topic here. So there's a rising school of thought, and I know Graham Hancock is in it, and Timothy Alberino is also in it, and Alberino says this is the flood. This is the Noahic flood, that there were things that, and there's probably a combination of things, where a combination of impacts and shift of the Earth's crust, potentially as a result of those impacts, and splitting of huge reservoirs of water that were contained under the crust. All of this came together to basically flood the earth, and it happened right around the time frame of Noah. Again, there's some argument about that depending on whether you have a Bible that's following the Masoretic text versus the Dead Sea Scroll text. We've talked about that stuff in earlier episodes, but we want to bring that to your attention, because if if you were to ask Alberino today, when was Noah's flood and what caused it, he would start talking about, based on what I've seen recently, he would start talking about the Younger Dryas impact theory, and why it's a very interesting theory and why it seems to line up very effectively with Noah's flood. And to be clear, that is catastrophism. That's a catastrophe of catastrophes. It would have reshaped the entire Earth. You would have gone from an Earth that was largely tropical with some ice caps or with some ice sheets. So you had this ice age where to the north and to the extreme south, there was a lot of ice, and everything in between was largely tropical, to an Earth that is a little more like today, where things are more spread out. There's this bizarre fossil record that we can't seem to sort out. There's huge water runoffs and massive channeling that happened, huge sediment beds that were put together, shifting of continents, rapid rising of mountain ranges, and basically the Earth looks completely different post-flood than it did pre-flood. There are other theories around the flood. I know Jason Schott is somebody we could bring back to talk about a theory that he's quite familiar with, that he's given me some material on that I think is also very interesting. And maybe I'll link to it in the show notes. But there are other theories that are also very, very good theories. And my conclusion looking at all of them is they're probably all partly right. I don't think any of them is completely wrong, because I do believe there was a global flood, and I do believe it was in the Noahic time frame. I don't necessarily feel like we know exactly when that was, but when we look at it, something around that time frame, it sure does seem like there was a very advanced civilization before the flood that was wiped out after the flood. I want to read real quickly a quote from the book of Second Peter, that Second Peter chapter 3, that Alberino brings up in the book, and I don't know if he applies it the same way I would, which is fine, but it's a really thought-provoking quote, and we've brought it up before. But in Second Peter chapter 3, verses 3 through 7, this is the NKJV, just because it's at my fingertips here. Peter says, "Scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, 'Where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation.'" End quote. "For this they willfully forget, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men." Okay, really weird, cryptic passage by Peter there. And the way Tim Alberino uses it in this chapter 9 of Birthright is kind of pointing out the flood. I take a little bit different angle on that and say, well, wait a second. When we get to Genesis 1, you see that the earth is already covered in water. And to me, it's worth wondering how many so we know the earth was covered with water before, and we've said that when you talk about the gap theory stuff, there's a very good case to be made that there was something on the earth before that, and clearly there was a flood. And then God reorganized the earth in the creation narrative in Genesis and separated the waters and separated the land and kind of remade everything out of this tohu abohu state. And then you had this advanced civilization rise, and then there was another flood. I don't know which one Peter's referring to in this. Maybe you could argue either one, but he's saying the scoffers in the last days will say everything's always been the same. That's a version of uniformitarianism. They're saying nothing's really changed, nothing's really happening. There's no catastrophe we have to be aware of, and this silly stuff, the old catastrophes, we don't buy it anymore. But he's saying in that passage I read, they willfully forget that the earth is standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed, the question is what then, perished, being flooded with water. And then he says, but today we have heavens and earth that are now preserved by the same word, but they're preserved for fire. And it's interesting that he throws the heavens in there. He lumps the heavens and the earth in together, that are preserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. So wanted to bring that up as one of the places where the Bible kind of ties those things together, the idea of past flood or floods and past catastrophe and future catastrophe and why it's relevant to us. In the midst of that, you have the argument that Alberino's making, and Dan, I'll hand it back to you to talk a little bit about this, that there was some advanced civilization that seemed to be predating the flood that God was specifically targeting the destruction of with the flood, whether it was through the Younger Dryas impact or some other mechanism for the flood. Which, by the way, if you're following scientific headlines, there's all kinds of headlines coming out right now. They're like, scientists discover that there are massive amounts of water under the Earth's crust, and nobody thought it was there, but it turns out there's more water under the crust than there is above it, according to some study or another. And it's like, yeah, that the Bible has talked about the fountains of the deep for thousands of years, and now we're just discovering that, looks like there's a lot of water down there. So I say that flippantly in passing.
Nice. Yeah, so moving along in the chapter a little bit. So if you're following along in the book, we've been going through, this is chapter 9. And so I think we're only going to make it through about half of chapter 9. And then the next time when we have Brian on, we're going to go through the second half of chapter 9 and chapter 10 kind of meshed together nicely. But, part of where this is going is the flood. Part of what the flood destroyed was the Golden Age. And we talked about this in a previous episode about Atlantis and the Golden Age, the time when men walked with the gods, and the flood destroyed that. And the flood has been around as a reminder of that destruction. But now people want it back. And so the second half of the chapter is going to get into things about people with these goals of, stated goals of bringing the Golden Age back, and then that'll tie into some really crazy stuff with Lucifer, with basically satanic worship and things like that. People just blatantly denying God, or not so much denying God as making him an enemy. And so, and that ties together with the reason that's all together in chapter 9, or at least the start of that in chapter 9, is because a lot of those worldviews kind of got their start with this idea of uniformitarianism and evolution, and where you can start erasing God by changing the way you see the world and seeing it in a way that is just gradually building upon itself, and you don't need a creator anymore, and you don't need judgment anymore, and it just all leads to this worldview that you can do what you want, which is what's going to lead into the second half of chapter 9 and chapter 10.
Yeah, so thanks for putting those things together. By the way, before I forget, one of the other flood theories that I really like, the one that Jason Schott introduced me to recently, is hydroplate theory. I didn't mention it by name before, so if anybody wants to look that up, there's a lot of good stuff out there, really thoughtful approach to the mechanics of the flood. So I want to split a hair here. There's a difference. It helps me, and maybe this will help the audience, to think about the difference between Satanism and Luciferianism. And I'm not a highly educated expert in either, and I'm better off for it. But Satanism, my understanding is that if you talk to somebody from the Church of Satan or Satanism in the secular sense, they don't necessarily even believe that Satan exists. It's more of a humanitarianism, or a humanism of kind of the do what thou wilt, and reject the idea, throw off the idea of God. And they subscribe to this very Darwinian concept in many cases. Contrasted with Luciferianism, which is the worship of the real devil. And that is getting into, so when people think of Satanism, a lot of times, when your grandma thinks of Satanism, a lot of times what she's actually thinking of is Luciferianism, which is the blood sacrifice, sex cult worship of of a fallen angel being who is alive and active and powerful in the world. That's not the same thing as say. So I'm just trying to clarify that, because one of them is very secular and one of them is highly religious. And in the mystery schools, and when we say the mystery schools, what we're talking about are these schools of thought that are really the modern day Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is a concept that goes all the way back to the New Testament. Paul talks about it a little bit. It's these, you think of Freemasonry, Helena Blavatsky. It's not stuff that we're going to go into today, but it's essentially these ancient ways of thinking, or the modern version of these ancient ways of thinking, of trying to tap into this old golden age power. And it tends to be quite Luciferian. However, they masquerade much more as satanic, which is more secular. So you get these mystery schools that kind of say, oh, we buy this Darwinian evolution. And then you find out that they're trying to, in some cases, tap into Luciferian power through ancient occult worship. Well, and those things seem, in many cases, to be at odds with one another. Like, how can you say that you're atheist but follow occult worship to gain power? And that actually works in the mind of somebody who's strictly pagan if they are saying, no, I believe that there is that this is the way the inner power of the world works, or the Gaia of the earth works, and I'm trying to tap into it through these rituals. So somehow they can remove the idea of Christ and God and a creator, but still wind up in an extremely religious place. And I think what we should expect as we get further into the end times, I think what we should expect is the insistent emergence of Christ in that narrative is going to be really frustrating to people who believe that they are trying to ascend as a human being by tapping into what they think is the true revealed truth that goes back to these old Gnostic schools and these old pagan and occult rituals, which they don't really see as religious. They see them as just understanding the hidden science behind everything. Occult worship is, a spiritual science. Ultimately, it's you A plus B equals C, and if you do the ritual right, if you do the experiment right, then you get such and such a result. And this is openly practiced and also practiced behind closed doors. And more, I think we're seeing that the rise of figures in Hollywood and other places, and I'm not naming names, that's not the point, but there seems to be strong undertones and undercurrents, and in many cases, out people who are flat out saying that they entered into these kinds of pagan and occult rituals in order to gain power, and that it was effective in them and suddenly they're catapulted onto a stage and they have all the wealth and fame and sex and everything else. And it's at the cost of their soul. You hear people say that jokingly, but it's actually quite common in the Hollywood circles and the entertainment circles. So why are we bringing all this up? Well, I'm bringing this up because ultimately what those practices are doing is they're trying to tap into an old science, and that old science would be the golden age science. And Timothy Alberino uses the idea of Atlantis to kind of capture that. And he would be among the first to say, I don't know if Atlantis is literally the thing that was, as Plato describes it in his writing. I don't know if Atlantis is really the civilization or if it's symbolic of the civilization, but there was some advanced civilization on Earth before the flood that seems to have been informed by technology that we would call supernatural, but you've heard me complain about that term. I don't like that term because it's not helpful. It's a catch-all that just is a lazy way of saying we don't get it, so we're just going to say it's magic. It's a spirit-level technology that some higher civilizations seem to have some understanding of that we don't understand today. And we see that in things like the pyramids. We don't know what they were doing or why or how. And if you think you have the pyramids completely figured out, you probably have not gone down enough. You probably haven't looked at enough perspectives on it because we just don't know. They're mind-boggling. The more we learn about them, the more we understand that we don't know what's going on. Maybe Nikola Tesla had something figured out. I don't know. But if you've been told your whole life that the pyramids are tombs, you should probably ask yourself why there's never been a body found in them, and why they're not designed like tombs. So just floating that out there. But we're looking at this stuff, these ancient technologies, and going, what were they doing? And then how did they do this? Because we have no clue. We don't know how they built it. And then it's not just one. Then we start realizing as we do satellite surveys of South America that there are entire civilizations in ruins that we didn't even know about that follow the same technology. And these megaliths all over the world, all over these different continents, follow this ancient technology that seemed to have been extremely purposeful and extremely successful, but is all destroyed. So this idea of Atlantis that Alberino is bringing up is he's saying, the short answer to, the short description of what chapter 9 is saying is, once upon a time, there was a very powerful civilization, and we'll talk about the origins of that civilization in a moment, and that civilization was wiped out by a catastrophe. And for some reason, we've all willfully forgotten that, a la exactly what I just quoted from 2 Peter. For some reason, we've all willfully forgotten that, but it's now that we're approaching the end times, it's kind of seems to kind of be coming back to the surface. And those things seem to be activating again, or people seem to be getting real interested in trying to figure out this old technology. And as Dan mentioned, these mystery schools, if you read their documents and read the writings of the people in charge of these mystery schools, they are openly saying that the point of what it is that they're trying to bring back is the golden age. I'm looking for the quote. Dan, maybe you know which one I'm thinking of, but there's a quote by Manly P. Hall. Here we go. I'm on page 175. The Critias first describes the blessed state of the Atlantean people under the benevolent rulership of 10 kings who were bound together in a league. These kings were monarchs over 7 islands and 3 great continents. From the fable, we can infer that the 10 rulers of the Atlantic League were philosopher kings endowed with all the virtues and wise guardians of the public good. These kings obeyed the laws of the divine father of their house, Poseidon, god of the seas. So what I just read is an excerpt from Manly P. Hall's The Secret Destiny of America, and Manly P. Hall is probably the greatest Freemason writer of all time. So what they're saying is that's the way things were back when it was good, and that's what we're trying to return to. What Alberino points out is that Atlantis is inexorably associated with the sea and its patron deity, Poseidon, and as you get into Revelation, you see Apollyon or Apollos rising from the sea, or this red dragon rising from the sea, and his name is Destruction. So a lot of these things start to tie in together, and to the point of being eerie, and we'll get into this a little bit more, I think, in the next episode. But the point is, this concept of the golden age is coming back. Now, how do we know it's coming back? Well, read your Bible. Paul told us in 2 Thessalonians that it has to come back. He says in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, this is the ESV, "Now concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered together to him, we ask you, brothers, not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed, either by a spirit or a spoken word, or a letter seeming to be from us to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Let no one deceive you in any way. For that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction," the Greek word for destruction is Apollo or Apollyon, "who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God." What he's describing there, and especially when you couple that with what these mystery schools are saying, is the return of the idea of the golden age has to come first, and that is the Antichrist paradigm. So the Antichrist paradigm is not a new concept, it's the reestablishment of an old concept, and specifically the old concept that was intentionally destroyed by God in the catastrophe of the flood, or what we call the flood. That's as far as as we're really getting in the conversation today. So Dan, before I want to give you a chance again to share your thoughts on that, and then I'll probably talk a little bit about where that age started and where it came from, just so that we can tie it in some of the earlier episodes. But I'll be quiet for a minute and let you share any thoughts or clarifications on the all the stuff I just threw out there.
No, go ahead. Keep rolling.
Alrighty, with Dan's permission, I'll keep rolling. So where did what is the golden age? The original golden age, where did it come from? Well, you're not going to be shocked, but we go back to Genesis 6, right? Genesis 6, 1-4, where you have the sons of God seeing the daughters of men. And again, if that's not familiar to you, you go back and listen to the podcast episodes. We've talked about this stuff ad nauseum, and we'll continue to, because it is important. I think this is the knowledge that needs to increase. But the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. They took wives, and they had offspring with them, and those offsprings were the Nephilim, or the giants of old. Now we know from other ancient documents, and it is supported in Scripture, and I think you can tie the two together. And we've talked about the Book of Enoch and some of these that go into a lot more detail about what happened in those civilizations. But these sons of God seemed to have shared a lot of secret knowledge. Now we're back to the mystery schools and secret technology with a selection of human beings, and specifically with their offspring and those who were most important to the cooperation of their offspring. So their offspring were these mighty men of old. And you can look at a lot of extra biblical material that supports this. And I'm not saying it's correct or true in every way, but it supports this idea when you look at, for example, the entire Greek, what we call the Greek mythology. That's exactly what you have. You have these divine beings, which are not God, by the way. They're just gods who are having sexual relationships with human beings, and sometimes hybrid human beings, and you're getting these resulting hybrids who are part divine and part supernatural, or part divine and part natural. And these are these heroes like Theseus and Hercules and these guys. When you put all the pieces together, you get this idea that there was this great civilization where this subset of beings had control over the earth. And what Timothy Alberino was saying is these gods who were not able to legally rule the earth because they were not humans. You have to remember the dominion of the earth was given to mankind in Genesis 3. These sons of God couldn't rule the earth directly because they're not mankind. But their offspring are enough mankind that they can legally rule the earth. So what you get are these very powerful semi-human beings that are controlling the entire planet and have access to this divine level of technology. Something we haven't talked a lot about is some of the ancient Indian documents from India, the Vedas in particular, the Upanishads, the Vedas. These ancient documents describe this stuff in great detail, down to what the technology was and how it worked. I mean, literally how it worked. They get into these, how the engines worked in it. They're talking about flying machines that have incredible range and speed and maneuverability. And then there's this big war Alberino points out that Athens and Atlantis were at war with each other. And that also, seems to reconcile with the Book of Enoch that talks about the part of the punishment for the fallen sons of God is that they see their offspring destroy each other in these cataclysmic battles that happen. But in the meantime, what you see is this highly advanced civilization spread all over the earth. And people like Graham Hancock are pointing out, like, hey, look, we have this incredible megalithic architecture here, and then you go to the other side of the world, and we have the exact same architecture over there. Explain that. If you can't explain it from a Darwinian narrative, but you can explain it from a narrative of non-human entities having interaction with the human race and sharing extremely powerful technology, which is what Graham Hancock would say. He just wouldn't say that the Bible has it right, even though that's exactly what the biblical narrative also describes. So that's the idea of the golden age. Then you have the flood, which is the catastrophe that destroys it. And meanwhile, the tradition and some of the secret portions of it are carried forward in these mystery schools, which are trying very hard to bring it back. And they intend to do it through the consolidation of one world government so that they can bring the philosopher king, exactly what Manly P. Hall described. That concept, that phrase philosopher king, is something that is replete throughout the mystery school terminology. And the philosopher king is set up as the new ruler of the earth and lines up exactly with what the Antichrist is in Scripture. So if you believe that there is a mystery school power behind a lot of what goes on in the world, if you believe that there's a reason why you have this extremely occult symbolism all over the world, and we can certainly go down those, but there's a lot of good reasons to believe it. There's a reason why you have a Ishtar and Isis and the symbology everywhere, where you have the monolithic structures sitting in front of the domes, and why they're placed as strategically where they are, everything from the Vatican to Washington, D.C. I mean, this is old mystery school stuff. That's what this stuff is, and it's done very, very intentionally, but not necessarily with explanation to the public, but behind the scenes, if you know what you're looking for, it's extremely intentional. If you believe that there is really a secret agenda behind it, then that secret agenda is to consolidate world government and bring forth a philosopher king to rule the earth and to tap back into that secret technology, which, as you've heard us say on other episodes, is what they were trying to do at the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel was a human attempt to reach back into that golden age. It was post-flood, and they were trying to reach back into the golden age to reestablish that communication and that technology. And that was where God showed up and said, no, this is not how this is going to go down, and changed the communication, and the peoples were scattered. So again, just throwing in that little nugget. So we've got the original golden age based on the fallen sons of God creating hybrid offspring to take over the rule of the earth, and to do that through advanced technology, which they wield over men to the point where mankind is really suffering under the crushing burden of these extremely powerful overlords. But at the same time, they're enjoying the benefits of a lot of this technology, but only a select few, most likely, of mankind are actually in positions of power there. It's destroyed by the flood, but it's not gone forever. Remember, the Bible says that there were Nephilim in those days and also afterwards. So it was, the civilization was destroyed, but the entire intelligence behind it was not destroyed. It's still very, very true. The spirits of those destroyed hybrid offspring are what we refer to as demons, and that's the demonic influence, where they are wandering the earth and trying to get back into bodies, and they have a fundamental hatred of humanity. And at the same time, you have the gospel, which says that Jesus Christ, who is the true and only full God and full man, is going to come and reclaim it all for himself and take dominion over the earth and raise mankind up to be the new sons and daughters of God, to replace these fallen sons and daughters of God. Again, a really good reason why our non-human older siblings absolutely hate us and really don't like us, and are always trying to send these messages that we're mismanaging the planet and we're terrible at it, and bad things are going to happen because of what bad managers we are, and how they could do a much better job if only we let them be in charge, like they were back in the golden age, and like they'd like to be again in the end of times. So I'll take a deep breath there. We're about 2 hours in, which Dan and I were like, oh, this will be a short episode, but I think we all know better at this point.
So much for that.
Yeah, so much for that. My voice is about shot, and I'm sure Brian's glad that he wasn't here to make it a 3 or 4 hour episode. But we look forward to having him back in the next one. But that's the crash course synopsis here, guys. That's what we're coming up to. And when we approach the end times, that's what's going on. That's what's happening. That's what the Antichrist is the secular narrative around the Antichrist is, good news, folks. We finally got back to the golden age. We can reestablish this. We can unite around this new figure. We've tapped back into the original technology. We just got to do something about these fools who keep talking about this Jesus guy, because he's the other potential ruler, and the secularists and the Antichrist ones obviously won't like him, and they won't like anybody who's loyal to him. And it will come down to a big battle, and that battle is called Armageddon, and Jesus is going to win. So, but it's not going to be peaches and cream in the meantime. Dan, I'll let you share your final thoughts. I know you've got some stuff around here, and then we'll wrap up the episode here.
Yeah, well, so one thing, tying this back into what we were talking about at the very beginning, right? You talked about the interview that we both heard, where the guy was talking about when when aliens come down and the religious nuts are gonna, I'll say, oh, they're from heaven, so we're gonna follow them, and those people will, get rid of their allegiances to their nation and follow their allegiance to these aliens coming down. I mean, you can certainly see how that plays right into the returning of the golden age. And Jesus warned us about these things at the end times. He says in Matthew 24:24, that false Christs and false prophets will arise before perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Right. So these things are going to happen, and I guess my last thought here is that,
well, just to jump with spiritual technology, to people who don't know what it is or how to do it, looks like the word that we would use for it is miracle. It looks like a miracle if somebody can do something that affects the physical realm by using an application of spiritual technology. So can the Antichrist perform signs and wonders? Absolutely. The golden age, that technology was real. I mean, they were building things that still stand today in ways that we don't understand, and they were probably doing it in ways that if we witnessed it, we would say, that is absolutely miraculous. There's no freaking way we can replicate that, because it's a completely different understanding of how the world works and what reality is versus our Newtonian physics approach to it, which is almost childish by comparison of the way that they were probably doing these things. So so we should expect that if these mystery schools are actually able to return to anything like the golden age, and if we're getting some hybrid human offspring with these beings, then they're going to be able to do stuff that you say, well, that must be from God, if they're doing things that we would think that only God could do.
Right. And if people are not firmly grounded in Christ beforehand, it's why it's called the Great Deception. And people are going to be deceived, and of course you would be, right? If you don't have a firm foundation in Christ and something comes along, aliens come down or whatever form it takes, and they're doing all these things and making all these claims, of course you're going to be like, well, they can obviously do things we can't do. They're obviously more advanced than we are, so we should probably listen. And so, that's part of the, Christ warns us ahead of time to be aware of it and to have that firm foundation in him.
And not only listen, but cooperate. When they say, hey, by the way, we want to give you a genetic upgrade, and you can get away from all these old human conditions that you have and move into this new ascended era. And when the Antichrist offers a firmware upgrade in your blood, and there's just some allegiance that has to happen, and you're going to become something a little bit besides human, which is, I would argue, and I think Tim Alberino also argues, is probably something along the lines of what the mark of the beast will be, because it's always going to be an inversion of the gospel. That's how Satan works. He takes the cross and flips it upside down. When you put that stuff together, then that's what you get. People who aren't firmly grounded, as Dan's describing, are going to say, I would like to have 0 chance of cancer and a very good chance of living to be 700 years old. Pick a number, whatever, a chance of living to be 100 years old and being healthy the whole time. And by the way, having my mind connected in telepathic ways to other minds, and some of which are greater intelligence than I am. I'd love to join that. Why not? Like, what's the downside? Well, the downside would be, the total renunciation of Christ's plan for humanity, which is his blood and his ascension and his kingship, which is the opposite of what the Antichrist is doing. So that's going to be the stakes. It's something like that. I don't know exactly how it will look, but something like that is what you want to start thinking about, is that's what the Antichrist stakes are going to be and what the mark of the beast stakes are going to be. That's why it's a little bit more than just, oh, did you get the barcode or not? It's, are you part of this movement of ascension of humanity by nefarious means that's going to seem really good and right and pure to those who are participating in it. It's as you can imagine, all the rules change when the stakes are that high.
Right, and I think the stage is being set for something to come and answer our questions. Right, there's so much division in the world right now. There's such a lack of trust. Right, there's nobody trusts the media anymore. The media, the news used to be something where people could go and think they were getting information. And now it's just blatantly obvious that news is people spouting opinions and having an agenda. And they don't even try to hide it anymore. People don't trust the government anymore. Even this whistleblower who's trying to come out and say, you know, these things are happening. I'm trying to, open your eyes. People don't even trust a whistleblower, and maybe rightfully so. Like we've discussed, maybe he's a honest whistleblower saying everything and saying exactly what he knows and nothing more, nothing less. But maybe not, and so there's just this huge lack of trust. And
there's another one. In the last 12 months, almost to the day when we're recording this, we have seen the total, and I believe, intentional and systematic undermining of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court. So we have the three branches of the U.S. government: the legislative, which is Congress and Senate, which nobody has ever trusted. I say that flippantly, but it's true in the modern era. And then you have the executive, which is the president, which people used to trust, and that's been completely dismantled, and nobody does anymore. We've got, it's when your choice is Trump or Biden, and everybody has their loaded ammo for either one. Nobody trusts the office of the president anymore. Everybody knows it's a joke. Well, the last one that was still standing was the Supreme Court. Well, what's happened with the Supreme Court? Well, it's been, first of all, it has been manipulated to take on nothing but extremely controversial views. We had Roe v. Wade overturned about a year ago, which on one hand, as somebody who believes in the sanctity of life and who, thinks abortion is a horrific part of our society that shouldn't be tolerated, and believes that there's much better approaches to dealing with unplanned pregnancies. I don't believe that the Supreme Court should be upholding abortion, but the way that whole situation was done, and the fact that it really hasn't resulted in any actual meaningful change of the issue, but has created a huge amount of anger and rage and distrust, combined with the systematic dripping of corruption by Supreme Court justices and the heavy barrage of Supreme Court rulings on this issue or that issue or the other issue, where no matter what side of the aisle you're on, you're going to be furious with the result. I believe all that's being done very intentionally, because that was the last great vestige of American democracy, with the legislative branch being down the tubes, where you've got Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene calling each other middle school insults on the floor. Meanwhile, you've got the executive branch, where you've got the ridiculous presidential choices that we have, where it's just a complete circus at this point. And the only thing that was left was the Supreme Court. And in the last 12 months, and before that, I mean, even when you look at the confirmation processes for the justices and all that, they were just turned into complete circuses. But I think the last 12 months in particular, everybody's angry at the Supreme Court, and nobody trusts it anymore, because it looks corrupt and manipulative, and it doesn't have anywhere near the veneer of dignity and justice that it had just a handful of years ago. So another rant, but I believe that that's been done intentionally. And so, Dan, to your point, everything's been divided. who used to be the great world leaders? Well, Putin used to be considered one of the more powerful leaders in the world. He's been turned into a circus act recently, and is all over the news even today as the fall of Putin, the mutiny against Putin, the desperation of Putin. Who's left? Who's the leader now? I mean, who is there in the world that really should be stepping to the vacuum? What currency is there? What governmental system is working right now? Well, none of them. And we shouldn't put our hope in the world by any means. And I'm okay with that. But the point is that, as Dan's saying, that the timing of this seems extremely convenient. It's really intersecting and coming to a collision course where it seems absolutely ripe for somebody or something to step in and say, look, guys, here's the answer you've been looking for. And by the way, it doesn't come from your traditional political systems. It's something much better and much higher. And what secular human wouldn't say, oh, thank goodness we have something here. I'm all in, if something were being offered that really appeared to be from a much more intelligent and wise source than we've been dealing with.
Yeah, so something coming along falsely claiming that we can finally trust it. And we got to keep in mind there is one that we can trust. The world also right now, the culture around us is very much about choose your own truth. What is truth? Which is a chilling thing that seems to be said as if it's a normal statement. That's a quote from Pontius Pilate. That's not something we want to be as our rallying cry, but like, what is truth seems to be just everywhere these days. And so, there is truth, and truth does matter. And remember that Jesus in John 14:6, he says, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And so, with all of this stuff, no matter what topic we're going to go to, we're going to tie it back to Jesus, because he is the only thing that we can really rely on. And he's, as much as there's all this different speculation and things that we don't know, there is something we do know, and it's the most important thing to know, which is that Jesus is Lord, that he's saved us, that he's made a way to reconcile us and to fix a fallen world and to put us in right relationship with him. And that's ultimately what matters more than anything. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, and thanks, Dan. That's always the right place to leave it. It is the truth. Our hope is in Christ. It cannot be in a new form of religion. It cannot be in an outside extraterrestrial threat or solution. It cannot be in the post-human paradigm of genetics, robotics, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, which, by the way, I'm saying those things in that order because as we move on in Birthright, then the overlap of those things, there's literally in the book, there's a Venn diagram of those three things: the new religion of apotheotheism, the alien threat, and the golden race, and the post-human paradigm. You overlap those three things, and in the middle, where in the Venn diagram where they all overlap, is the new golden age and the revealing of Apollo. So that's where we're heading with this, and hopefully you got a healthy dose of that today. But the answer to all of that is Christ. Christ is the Son of God and the Son of Man. He's the only begotten Son of God, and he is the only true and perfect Son of Man. He's the only one who offers redemption and restoration to the human race, and he's the only one who can defeat and who will defeat these rebellious beings who hate humanity and who want every good thing that's been given to humanity. Christ can restore what's good and right, and he can restore us to our rightful relationship with our Creator. And anything more than that or anything less than that is Antichrist. And we got to be informed. We got to be prepared for it. So this stuff, as we're throwing out all this stuff that seems doom and gloom, I mean, in one way, yeah, it's dark and it's heavy stuff. But on the other side, this is super exciting because this is what Jesus died for. This is what he resurrected for. And the good news, guys, is he's already defeated this stuff. When Jesus crushed the head of Satan and took the keys of death and Hades, the victory's already won. He already has the power and the authority. There's a reason that demons flee at his name. There's a reason why the enemy cannot stand the presence of Christ, the name of Christ. We who are in Christ have the Spirit of Christ. It's there, 2 Corinthians chapter 2. It's there. We have the Spirit of Christ, and He's given it to us. Us, the cracked vessels that we are, the unworthy ones that we are, the ones who have been deceived and manipulated and abused by Satan and his minions. We have the Spirit of Christ, and the Spirit of Christ overcomes all the other spirits. And we live in the conflict of that. And from time to time, it seems really, really dark, but it's guaranteed that we're heading to victory. And you have to be asking yourself, have I staked my life? Have I staked my soul? Have I staked my future on that? And am I willing to believe that at any cost? Well, what's your alternative? I mean, really, the Antichrist, is that really such a better way of an outside extraterrestrial presence that will manipulate and lie and abuse and usurp authority, and who behind the scenes hates you but finds you really useful for what it's trying to gain? Is that really who you want to serve? Haven't you had enough of that? That's not what Christ does. Christ already has the victory. He already has the authority. All the power is his. And it is by grace that he offers those things to us, not by manipulation, not by need, not through deception. It's through recognition of truth and by his absolute grace that he's offering us a chance to participate in his very family. And that's the gospel. It is good news. It's incredible news that there is that we have the choice to return to our rightful relationship with our Creator, and that can be done by Christ. And it's good news that how clear it is that there is absolutely no other way, and all other ways are going to be revealed for what they are, which is Antichrist. So on one hand, yeah, it's heavy stuff, it's dark stuff. On the other hand, this is the most exciting time that ever has been since Christ walked to the earth, and to see the revelation of what it is that he accomplished on our behalf, and to be here for the consummation of those things. And I don't know when it is. I speak of it as a certainty because it is a certainty. I don't know exactly when. It just seems like it's coming sooner and sooner. To be able to speak openly about the consummation of those things, and to know that it's happening, and that we're seeing the early stages of that and rapidly approaching that reality. And if I'm wrong, if I'm off by 500 years, so what? The point is, it's still true. It's a super exciting time to be studying our scripture, and a really exciting time to be talking about Christ, not as a religious pursuit, not as a lifestyle, but as the reality of what it is to be a human being, and what it means to be made in God's image. And that suddenly those things are that the definition of those things really matters. Maybe for the first time in a long time, something you heard in Sunday school is suddenly going, oh, it's a big deal, isn't it? It's relevant. It matters today. It's in the headlines today. And I need to be able to tell the difference of one thing from the other. So we call you to reorient yourself, no matter where you are in your relationship with Christ. We urge you to look to him, to take the time and the energy to look to him, and to marvel at him and who he is and what he's offering to you, and the grace that he's extended to you. And all he asks in return is that you recognize him for who he is, not because he needs it, but because that's your way out. He asks you to have faith in him, to say, yeah, he is who he says he is. And that means that you are who he says you are. And who he says you are is somebody worth dying for, worth dying to save. And he demonstrated it with his own blood. So turn to Christ. As Dan says, it always comes back to Christ, no matter what topic we're on. And you can find the truth about him in Scripture. And more what we're seeing is Scripture really seems to have had a perfect handle on all of these things all along, and it's going to continue to be blatantly obvious. So we thank you for being here with us for this 18th episode of the Mystery Bible On podcast. We're so glad you could join us. Please do share these episodes with your friends. Make sure you post them, review them, join our discussions. We appreciate each and every single one of you. we're so glad you're here. We're so grateful that we're able to talk about these things with you through this incredible podcast and internet technology that we have available. We're grateful for our co-hosts, for all of you who may be able to join us in the future. We're thankful that God's given us minds and material and the ability to increase our knowledge of Him in this day and age. And we want to be salt and light in the world. We want to be pointing the world towards Christ in these uncertain times. And we hope that we've been able to do that with this episode. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to the next episode.